The problems of peace came in the aftermath of war. The conquering Union armies had cut a path of burned-out plantation fields, overgrown with weeds and railroads, without tracks, bridges, or rolling stock. The utter collapse of the Confederate government left many areas at the mercy of marauding bands of guerrillas and deserters. For example, near Columbia, South Carolina, a pile of 65 horses and mules killed by Sherman's army lay unburied for 6 weeks because the troops had carried away all of the spades and other tools. Hunger stalked the land, threatening starvation for whites and blacks alike. The Yankees had remained to restore the South because of the vacuum left by the devastation. Into that vacuum came the Freedmen's Bureau. Northern relief agencies and about 200,000 occupation troops. They functioned as the main source of law and order in the post-war South. The Army had placed the ex-Confederate states under martial law. Military courts punished criminals. Army hospitals treated thousands of civilians, both black and white. Freedmen's Bureau courts also regulated relations between former slaves and their former masters. In the summer of 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau issued 150,000 daily rations. 1/3 of those rations went to white refugees, and the Army fed just as many more Southern civilians. From 1865 to 1870, the Bureau issued nearly 22 million rations. The Treasury Department sent special agents into the South to seize whatever Confederate cotton had survived the war. In terms of economics, the price per bale of cotton had went up to $200, and cotton had the power to corrupt. Some Treasury men and Army officers seized privately owned cotton and stamped it CSA and sold it on their own accounts. Some of these men extorted bribes from landowners not to take their cotton. Congress levied a tax of 2.5 cents per pound on cotton in 1865 and 1866. They raised that tax to 3 cents. The purpose of these actions was to defray the cost of the war, but these actions appeared vengeful to the South. It also retarded the region's economic recovery. Congress finally repealed the cotton tax in 1868, yet the attitude of the South was a defiant spirit toward Yankees, and they exhibited violence toward freedmen. Southern whites were a proud people who had staked all and lost all, so their hatred for their conquerors was a natural response. An innkeeper in North Carolina told a Northern journalist in 1865 that Yankees had killed his soldier son, burned his house, and stolen his slaves. This type of attitude was very prevalent among non-combatants. Keyword non-combatants, people that didn't fight in the war. Non-combatants had endured the suspense, the hardship, and the agony of war with no outlet for their anguish. Many had been forced to watch helplessly as the invaders destroyed their property. After the fighting ended, their pent-up frustrations exploded in expressions of hatred and often in violence. The freed slaves and Southern white Unionists became surrogate victims of frustrated Southerners who didn't dare to assault the real symbols of their humiliation, the Yankee soldiers. Women had a particularly hostile view. Out of the war, the Confederates had only one for themselves: 85,000 widows and 200,000 fatherless children, as well as fathers, brothers, and cousins that were deceased. The formation of the Southern Women Confederate Memorial Associations is what followed that. These groups sent commissions of women to Civil War battlefields to disinter the remains of Southern soldiers who had been hastily buried and bring them home for reinterment with dignity in hundreds of Confederate cemeteries throughout the South. We have one of these Confederate cemeteries here in Charlotte, and it's actually an earshot away from the Panther Stadium right here on Cedar Street. But anyway, this Confederate memorial lies just feet away from very influential people in the city of Charlotte, such as the name Davidson, Alexander, These solemn ceremonies form the basis for the lost cause, a mentality that underlies Southern defiance of Reconstruction and the creation of a mythology about the Old South, slavery, and the Civil War. If you go to this cemetery in Charlotte, I guarantee you're going to see a type of tourism there that you didn't know existed. This mythology persists even today under the auspices of the United Daughters of the Confederacy and similar organizations. Former soldiers had temporarily had enough of defiance. The fraternization across lines with Billy Yank and the liberal surrender terms, which protected Confederate soldiers from punishment for treason, also worked for the reconciliation of veterans. But I pose another question. What was the attitude at the time towards Northern whites? Remember, when we started this, we asked you to put yourself in a position of who would you have been in this particular time period in history. Would you have been a newly freed slave? Would you have been an immigrant new to America? Would you have been a capitalist, an industrialist, a landowner? Just pick a role and try to put yourself in those shoes. So, as conquerors, Northerners, they couldn't agree on what terms to impose. Lincoln had been assassinated, and initially, the new president, Andrew Johnson, appeared to endorse a draconian policy that treason is a crime and that crime must be punished. Traitors must be punished and impoverished. Their great plantations must be seized and divided into small farms. Republicans minimally wanted absolute repudiation of secession, guarantees for the freedom and civil rights of emancipated slaves, security and political power for Southern Unionists, and at least temporary political disqualification of leading ex-Confederates. Democrats alternatively favored a policy of self-reconstruction, which would have allowed Southern states to proclaim their loyalty to the Union, to supervise the election of new congressmen and senators, and then to carry on as if the war had never occurred. Radical Republicans viewed Reconstruction as a revolution. The Radicals desired to overthrow the power of the Confederate ruling class by disenfranchisement and confiscation. The Radicals wanted to enfranchise the freedmen and give them confiscated land. In place of large estates, widely scattered settlements, wasteful agriculture, popular ignorance, social degradation, the decline of manufacturers, and contempt for honest labor and a pampered oligarchy, Republicans wanted to sponsor small farms, thrifty tillage, free schools, social independence, flourishing manufacturers, and the arts, respect for honest labor, and the equality of political rights. With that being said, President Johnson at the time moved toward the Democratic position and broke from the party that had put him in office. Presidential Reconstruction actions were as follows. So if we're looking for some type of suit or some type of basis, we're going to be suing the executive branch based on the actions of President Andrew Johnson. So first, let me give you a little bit of description about President Johnson before we go into his policies. President Andrew Johnson was the most self-consciously plebeian of American presidents, and he found no room in his definition of the common people for non-whites. Unlike Lincoln, Johnson demonstrated no capacity for growth and flexibility in his attitudes. Although Johnson initially seemed to agree with radicals on the need to punish rebels, his fundamental convictions clashed with Republican ideology in two crucial respects. Johnson was a Jacksonian Democrat to the core, and he shared Andrew Jackson's suspicion of banks, corporations, bondholders, and of New England in general. This is Andrew Johnson that we're talking about, but he was a Jacksonian Democrat who followed the ideologies of Andrew Jackson. He opposed the Whig or the Republican policy of using government to promote economic development. His enemies list included both the plantation aristocracy and the bloated, corrupt commercial industrial economy emerging in the Northeast. He never subscribed to liberal tenets of equality. And he also proved to be hostile toward the Republican vision of freedmen in society. He owned slaves himself and was committed to white supremacy. His character can be summed up in two quotes from two separate instances. During the war, when a Union Army officer had commented that the government was turning the conflict into a crusade to free the slaves, President Johnson exclaimed, "Damn the Negroes. Damn the Negroes. I'm fighting these traitorous aristocrats, their masters." In 1866, a delegation of blacks headed by Frederick Douglass urged the merits of black suffrage as a condition of Reconstruction. The president parried their arguments and afterwards remarked to his secretary, "Those damn sons of bitches thought they had me in a trap. I know that damn Douglass. He's just like any other nigger and would sooner cut a white man's throat than not. White man alone must manage the South." This was President Johnson's quote. So on May 29th of 1865, the president issued two significant proclamations. The first offered amnesty and restitution of property except slaves to all who would take an oath of allegiance, with the exception of several categories. The second proclamation named a provisional governor for North Carolina and directed him to call an election of delegates to frame a new state's constitution. Only white men who had taken an oath of allegiance and had received amnesty could take part in this process. In subsequent weeks, Johnson issued similar proclamations for 6 other southern states. He also recognized the Lincoln-sponsored governments of Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee, and designated the wartime Loyalist government that had administered the part of Virginia under Union military control as the official government of that state. Johnson himself was a self-made man. The death of his father, who was a porter in North Carolina, had left his family impoverished, making it necessary for Johnson to take an apprenticeship as a tailor. He moved to the mountain country of East Tennessee, married a shoemaker's daughter who taught him how to write. He acquired a farm and slaves, served as a state legislature, the governor, a congressman, a senator, vice president, and finally president. A Jacksonian Democrat and a self-proclaimed champion of the common people, Johnson never lost his plebeian pride. "Someday I will show those stuck-up aristocrats who's running this country." But as the post-assassination fervor subsided, the mood toward traitors softened. President Johnson gave no more speeches about branding treason and odious crime. So we saw what President Johnson's policies were at the time. The next one is going to look at, part 2 is going to look at what was the Republican response to these presidential Reconstruction items.